readers, welcome back to Reads with Rune B with me, Rune B, and
Ash, hello.
my partner in crime. Today we are continuing with A Little Princess, and we are on chapter 19, the very last chapter, so we finally get to see how the story ends.
Yeah, and so do you guys.
Yeah, so let's find out. Chapter 19, Anne.
Never had such joy reigned in the nursery of the large family. Never had they dreamed of such delights as resulted from an intimate acquaintance with the little girl who was not a beggar. The mere fact of her sufferings and adventures made her a priceless possession. Everyone wanted to be told over and over again the things which had happened to her. When one was sitting by a warm fire in a big glowing room, it was quite delightful to hear how cold it could be in an attic. It must be admitted that the attic was rather delighted in, and though its coldness and barrenness quite sunk into insignificance when Melchizedek was remembered, and one heard about the sparrows and what things one could see if one climbed onto the table and stuck one's head out and shoulders out of the skylight. Of course, the thing loved best was the story of the banquet and the dream which was true. Sarah told it for the first time that day after she'd been found. Several members of the large family came to take tea with her, and they sat or curled up upon the hearth rug. She told the story in her own way, and the Indian gentleman listened and watched her. When she had finished, she looked up at him and put her hand on his knee.
That's my part,
she said.
Now won't you tell your part of it, Uncle Tom?
He had asked her to call him always Uncle Tom.
I don't know your part yet, and it must be beautiful.
So he told them how, when he sat alone, ill, dull, and irritable, Ramdas had tried to distract him by describing the passers-by, and there was one child who passed oftener than anyone else. He had begun to be interested in her, partially because he was thinking a great deal of a little girl, and partially because Ramdas had been able to relate the incident of his visit to the attic in chase of the monkey. He had described its cheerless look, and the bearing of the child, who seemed as if she was not of the class of those who were treated as drudges and servants. Bit by bit, Ramdas had made discoveries concerning the wretchedness of her life. He had found out how easy a matter it was to climb across the few yards of roof to the skylight, and this fact had been the beginning of all that followed.
Sahib,
he had said one day,
I could cross the slates and make the child a fire when she is out on some errand, and when she returned, cold and wet, to find it blazing, she would think a magician had done it.
The idea had been so fanciful that Mr. Castford's sad face had lighted with a smile, and Ramdas had been so filled with rapture that he had enlarged upon it and explained to his master how simple it would to be accomplished number of other things. He had shown a childlike pleasure and invention, and the preparations for the carrying out of the plan had filled many a day with interest which would otherwise have dragged wearily. On the night of the frustrated banquet, Ramdas had kept watch, all of his packages being in readiness in the attic which was his own, and the person who was to help him had waited with him, as interested as himself in the odd adventure. Ramdas had been lying flat, looking at the skylight, where this banquet had come to its disastrous conclusion. He had been sure of the profoundness of Sarah's wearied sleep, and then, with the dark lantern, he crept into the room, while his companion remained outside and handed the things to him. When Sarah had stirred ever so faintly, Ramdas had closed the lantern slide and lain flat upon the floor. This and many other exciting things the children found out by asking 1,000 questions.
I am so glad,
Sarah said.
I am so very glad that it was you who were my friend.
There never were such friends as these two became. Somehow they seemed to suit each other in a wonderful way. The Indian gentleman had never had a companion he'd liked quite as much as he liked Sarah. In the month's time he was, as Mr. Carmichael had prophesied, he would be a new man. He was always amused and interested, and he began to find an actual pleasure in the possession of the wealth he had imagined that he had loathed the burden of. There were so many charming things to plan for Sarah. There was a little joke between them that he was a magician, and it was one of his pleasures to invite things to surprise her. She found beautiful new flowers growing in her room, whimsical little gifts tucked under pillows. And once, as they sat together in the evening, they heard the scratch of a heavy paw on the door. And when Sarah went to find out what it was, there stood a great dog, a splendid Russian boarhound, with a grand silver and gold cloak bearing the inscription, "I am Boris." It read, "I serve the Princess Sarah."
There was nothing that the Indian gentleman loved more than the recollection of the little princess in rags and tatters. The afternoons in which the large family, or Ermengarde and Lottie, gathered to rejoice together were delightful, but the hours when Sarah and the Indian gentleman sat alone and read or talked had a special charm of their own. During their passing, many interesting things occurred. One evening, Mr. Carrisford looked up from his book and noticed that his companion had not stirred for some time, but sat gazing into the fire.
"What are you supposing, Sarah?"
he asked. Sarah looked up, with bright color on her cheek.
"I was supposing,"
she said.
"I was remembering that hungry day and a child I saw."
"But there were a great many hungry days,"
said the Indian gentleman with a rather sad tone in his voice.
"Which hungry day was it?"
"I forget you didn't know,"
said Sarah.
"It was the day the dream came true."
Then she told him the story of the shop, of the fourpence she had picked out of the sloppy mud, of the child who was hungrier than herself. She told it quietly and simply, and in as few words as possible, but somehow the Indian gentleman found it necessary to shade his eyes with his hand and look down at the carpet.
"And I was supposing a kind of plan,"
she said when she had finished.
"I was thinking I should like to do something,"
"What is it?"
said Mr. Carrisford in a low tone.
"You may do anything you like, Princess."
"I was wondering,"
rather hesitated Sarah.
You say I have so much money. I was wondering if I could go to the bun woman and tell her that when hungry children, particularly on those dreadful days, come and sit on the steps or look in at the window, she could just call them in and give them something to eat. She might send the bills to me. Could I do that?"
"You shall do it tomorrow morning,"
said the Indian gentleman.
"Thank you,"
said Sarah.
"You see, I know what it is to be hungry, and it is very hard when one cannot even pretend it away."
Yes, my dear,"
said the Indian gentleman.
Yes, it must be. Try to forget it. Come and sit on the footstool near my knee, and only remember you are a princess."
"Yes,"
said Sarah, smiling.
"and I can give buns and bread to the populace."
And she went and sat on the stool, and the Indian gentleman, he used to like her to call him that too sometimes, drew her small dark head down on his knee and stroked her hair. The next morning, Miss Minchin, out of character, looking out of her window, saw the thing.
But we really don't like her.
No. Right, so the next morning, Miss Minchin, in looking out of her window, saw the thing she perhaps least enjoyed seeing. The Indian gentleman's carriage, with its tall horses, drew up before the door of the next house, and its owner and a little figure, warm with soft, rich furs, descended the steps to get into it. The little figure was a familiar one, and reminded Miss Minchin of days in the past. It was followed by another as familiar, the sight of which she found very irritating. It was Becky, who, in character of delighted attendant, always accompanied her young mistress to her carriage, carrying wraps and belongings. Already Becky had a pink, round face. A little later, the carriage drew up before the door of the baker's shop, and its occupants got out. Oddly enough, just as the bun woman was putting a tray of smoking hot buns into the window. When Sarah stepped into the shop, the woman turned, looked at her, and leaving the buns, came and stood behind the counter. For a moment she looked at Sarah very hard indeed, and then her good-natured face lightened up.
"I'm sure I remember you, miss,"
she said.
"And yet—"
"Yes,"
said Sarah.
"Once you gave me 6 buns for 4 pence, and—"
"You gave 5 of them to a beggar child,"
the woman broke in on her.
"I've always remembered it. I couldn't make it out at first."
She turned around to the Indian gentleman and spoke her next words to him.
"I beg your pardon, sir, but there's not many young people that notices a hungry face in that way, and I've thought of it many a time. Excuse the liberties, miss,"
To Sarah.
"but you look rosier and, well, better than you did that,"
"I am better, thank you,"
said Sarah.
"and I am much happier. I've come to ask you to do something for me,
Me, miss?
exclaimed the bun woman, smiling cheerfully.
Why, bless you. Yes, miss, of course. What can I do for you?
Then Sarah, leaning on the counter, made her little proposal concerning the dreadful days and the hungry waifs and the buns. The woman watched her and listened with an astonished face.
Why, bless me.
She said again when she heard it all.
It'll be my pleasure to do it. I'm a working woman myself, and can't afford to do much on my own account, though there's sights of trouble on every side. But if you excuse me, I'm bound to say I've been giving away many bits of bread since that wet afternoon, just along thinking of you, and how hungry and cold and wet you was. And yet you gave away your 4 hot buns as if you were a princess.
The Indian gentleman smiled involuntarily at this, and Sarah smiled a little too, remembering what she had said to herself when she put the buns down on the ravenous child's ragged lap.
She looked so hungry.
She said.
She was even hungrier than I was,
She was starving,
said the woman.
Many the times she told me of it since, how she sat there in the wet and felt as if there was a wolf tearing at her poor young innards.
Oh, have you seen her since then?
Exclaimed Sarah.
Do you know where she is?
Yes, I do,
answered the woman, smiling more good-naturedly than ever.
Why, she's in their back room, miss, and has been for a month, and a decent well-meaning girl she's gone turn out, and such a help to me in the shop and in the kitchen as you scarce believe, knowing how she's lived.
She stepped to the door of the little black back parlour and spoke. The next minute a girl came out and followed her behind the counter, and actually it was the baker child, clean and neatly clothed and looking as if she had not been hungry for a long time. She looked shy, but she had a nice face, now that it was no longer savage, and the wild look had gone from her eyes. She knew Sarah in an instant, and she stood and looked at her as if she could never look long enough.
You see,
said the woman,
I told her to come in when she was hungry, and when she came I gave her odd jobs to do, and I found she was willing, and somehow I got to like her. In the end it was I'd given her a place in her home, and she helps me and behaves me well, and is as thankful as a girl can be. Her name's Anna. She has no other.
The children stood and looked at each other for a few minutes, and then Sarah took her hand out of her muff and held it across the counter, and Anne took it, and they looked straight into each other's eyes.
I'm so glad,
said Sarah.
I have just thought of something. Perhaps Miss Brown will let you be the one to give the buns and bread to the children. Perhaps you'd like to do it because you know what it is to be hungry too.
Yes, miss,
said the girl, and somehow Sarah felt as if she understood her, though she said so little, and only stood still and looked after as she went out of the shop with the Indian gentleman, and they got into the carriage and drove away.
The end.
Thank you for this journey with us.
Yeah, thank you for reading with us. We hope you liked it as much as we did.
Mm-hmm.
We hope you had fun listening to us. We certainly had a good time reading it.
And look out for the other reads.
Yes, and our next read will be A Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burdett. So be looking for that, and we will see you next time. Thanks again. Keep reading. Stay safe. Be excellent. Bye for now.